He did it. Taylor shot Bill. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, Taylor and I, we've had our moments, but it's always been kind of innocent, somewhat. And one thing leads to...
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Jeff Glor at the U.S. Capitol. And in a short time, the body of George H.W. Bush, the 41st president of the United States, will be brought here to lie in state. It has just arrived at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland from Texas on board a jet that often serves as Air Force One. For this flight, it was called Special Air Mission 41. Mr. Bush, who lived longer than any previous president, died Friday at 94, less than 8 months after the death of Barbara Bush, his wife of 73 years. He will be brought here by motorcade. It's about a 45-minute trip for his final visit to the Capitol. Earlier this morning, Mr. Bush's casket was brought from his adopted hometown of Houston to Ellington Field in Texas for the flight to Washington. There he was honored with Hail to the Chief and a 21-gun salute, one of 3 planned for today. He was sent off by local politicians as well as 26 recipients of the Daily Points of Light, an award that began during Mr. Bush's administration to celebrate volunteerism and the power of service. There will be a ceremony to honor Mr. Bush at Joint Base Andrews, which you're about to watch. The Bush family, including George W. Bush, the 43rd president, will be greeted by members of the military, Air Force One personnel, members of the CIA, as well as 100 sailors from the aircraft carrier, the USS George H.W. Bush. Another 21-gun salute will follow. I am joined here this afternoon by CBS This Morning's Norah O'Donnell, and in our Washington studio by Bob Schieffer, John Dickerson, Margaret Brennan, and Major Garrett. Weijia Jiang is at the White House. Nancy Cordes is on Capitol Hill. And Ed O'Keefe is at Joint Base Andrews. Ed, to you to start here, set the scene for us and what we're about to see.
Good afternoon, Jeff. Yes, this is Special Air Mission 21. The 747, normally known as Air Force One, has just arrived here in the last few moments, and the former president will be brought down, and a roughly 30-car motorcade will begin to the U.S. Capitol. Waiting for him here, as you mentioned, are members of the USS George H.W. Bush, the naval aircraft carrier based at Norfolk, Virginia, members of the U.S. Air Force, members of the Army's Golden Knights, the parachute team with whom he has jumped 4 times, his 75th, 80th, 85th, and 90th birthdays. We've also spotted here on the tarmac his son Jeb Bush, the former governor of Florida, Marvin Bush, and Doro Bush. Those 3 Bush siblings did not make the flight from Texas, but they are here with their families just over our shoulder, awaiting the motorcade to begin. Quite a scene here, and this will the former president will later today become the 12th U.S. president to lie in state at the Rotunda, but we should probably reflect on the realm of this in terms of presidential history. Never before in modern times, at least, have we seen one former president escorted to the beginnings of national remembrances by another former president, his son, George W. Bush. We've seen these types of televised services and days of remembrance before, but never quite like this. The ceremony is about to begin now that the door's opening. They've asked us here on the tarmac to pause and allow the nation to watch, so we should do that.
All right, Ed, thank you very much. We will be watching as well and pausing as needed to appreciate the weight of these circumstances that we're looking at right now. Ed, you mentioned how long it's been. It has been 12 years since a presidential funeral, since Gerald Ford in 2006. Norah's here with me as, again, the doors open and we await the family to walk out here. But this day is remarkable in Washington. It's a spectacular day here.
It is in the 60 degrees, a beautiful sun behind us, greeting the former president as he makes his final stop here in Washington, a place that he lived for many years as vice president for 2 terms and as a single-term president. As you mentioned, Jeb Bush, one of his sons there is Marvin Bush, his youngest son there. He had 6 children, the entire family, all the grandkids, most of them all on that plane coming here. And what's really remarkable is the grandeur of this event. Not only the military military greeting him there, those from the USS George H.W. Bush, and they are greeting a man who started his life taking off. He flew torpedo bombers off an aircraft carrier. In fact, he logged 1,200 hours for the Navy, flying 58 combat missions. And so this is a sign of respect from the military back to him as well. And then James Baker, his longtime friend, who, you know, was with him there at the end, rubbing his hands and his feet as he passed away. He'll come here ahead of the family, make sure everything's set, meet with Vice President Quayle, and also begin what is going to be a bipartisan, bicameral event here as he is welcomed here to the Capitol to lie in state.
I keep coming back to this, the number of family members traveling with him. I mean, 17 members of the family on board this plane.
That's what happens when you have
talk about his
6
political
kids.
service, right? And the service to country, but the service to family, and the constant attention to them. And by the way, the constant attention to the Secret Service, who will play an extra special role over the next few days because of the care and the compassion that he showed for them, not leaving on Thanksgiving, not leaving on Christmas, because he was concerned about their families as well. All of these things, as we discuss, it just gives you a better appreciation of exactly what we're all watching right now.
One of his grandsons on that trip, Pierce Bush, has talked about that when he got in trouble, that Poppy would write a note and say, "Don't worry, it's not that bad." You know, a note that made you always feel better. And so not only did former President George W. Bush write handwritten notes to people that he worked with, he wrote them to his family and made them feel better. And that is really the lifelong friendship that he not only developed with many people, but within his own family, that many in his own family looked up to him as sort of the patriarch, really, of this family. So it is a passing of the patriarch, too, of the Bush family.
And so as we watch this at Joint Base Andrews here, the president will lie in state here this evening. We'll watch this ceremony tonight, this evening, tomorrow, and then the funeral at the National Cathedral will happen on Wednesday. Bob Schieffer, John Dickerson, Margaret Brennan, also here in D.C. in our bureau. Bob, as you watch all this, what goes through your mind?
Well, you know, we are seeing the symbols of our democracy here. And in modern times, Air Force One has become as symbolic of America and what it stands for as the White House or the Washington Monument. It is one of the most recognized symbols of America all over the world. And what we're seeing here is, as we pay tribute to a president who has died, it is a reminder that what this country is. We elect our presidents, they take office at a certain date. When their term is up, they leave. They are accorded special respect for the rest of their lives, and we're seeing that unfold here today. And I think that is very important, to remember those things. And to me, what this is a remembrance not just of George Bush, but a remembrance of America and what it's all about.
Sure. And how it continually changes. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
No, just to pick up on what Bob was saying there, I think, you know, I'm reminded of the other funeral that all of us just lived through with John McCain, the senator passing along, and how the two events back to back in many ways caused us as a country not just to mourn the passing of a leader, but also to reflect on who they are and what they represent about us as a country. And I feel like at this moment in time, when we're questioning that in the tumult of our politics day to day, that these moments do provide a pause. We're not talking about the brawl happening on Capitol Hill. We are talking about what this leader represents to us. You hear words describing the kind of Republican establishment that he represented, George H.W. Bush, how different it is from today. You hear words like restraint, diplomacy, you know, really experienced at the highest levels of some of the most difficult positions you could have. Head of the CIA, UN ambassador.
That's right. Well, it's a mourning of a life and a celebrating of a life. It's a celebrating of a way of life. And the question in Washington is whether it's also a mourning of that way of life, that dedication to service, long time dedication to expertise and kind of climbing up the ladder in the traditional way. I'm reminded, we're talking about the weather, the sunshine, when George Bush went to his inauguration, it was a rainy, overcast day, and President Reagan said, you know, when I was governor of California, as soon as I put my hand on the Bible, the sun shone, trying to give a little optimism to his successor. Well, sure enough, when Billy Graham started to give his remarks at the inauguration, the sun came out, Bush pointed to the sky, and he and President Reagan exchanged a little nod to one another as if that's the way these things happen. So the fact that he's being greeted by this weather in Washington feels like all is of a piece.
And this is a gradual process, plays out over 4 days, to give the country plenty of time to soak in this moment and take a measure of a presidency from a bit of distance. And all of us around this table who have either worked at the White House or come to study it have understood that that space and time helps you gain a lot more perspective on what the world looked like in the Oval Office when those decisions we were covering and explaining to the American public were happening, and the import and the influence they had 5, 10, 20 years later. And for the George Herbert Walker Bush presidency, so much of that looks better at a distance than it looked at the time.
You know, I think that's right. And I think I have come to believe that you should not judge a presidency for at least 5 years, because you don't know when the president leaves office what the impact of his remarks are going to be.
And the way it is now, people will judge within 5 minutes or 5 seconds.
5 seconds on Twitter.
You know, George Bush, we look at the presidency now as a kind of action hero office. You know, the president has to jump in and do things. And George Bush said, sometimes you shape events by not making any mistakes. In other words, not acting. Tough to cover non-action.
Well, the hyper-personalization of the presidency has become a dominant part of our American politics. He eschewed that.
Okay. Thank you all. All of you have been watching. I've been watching the coverage all day. You made some remarkable and poignant comments here about this moment that we are in. It's worth noting again the pause that is taking place now amid the onslaught of news. And it is important, also important, I think, to listen in and watch this honor guard for a moment. Okay, so what you're watching here is the honor guard then lines up. There's about a little under 500 people who are at Joint Base Andrews right now who have come out for this arrival to watch right now. A couple escorts are going to take place here right now. President and Mrs. George W. Bush will be escorted by Major General Howard from Joint Force Headquarters, National Capital Region. He's the commanding general.
There we see the former Secretary of State James Baker and his wife. As we mentioned, they will be the first to leave and head straight here to the Capitol to meet the former Vice President Dan Quayle.
Secretary Baker making those remarkable comments about his final moments with the former president.
Followed by
the other night, George P. Bush. Jeb Bush's eldest son, his wife. Again, we talked about the 17 family members and just the enormous family that they're all traveling with there. As we watch them, we're also seeing significant buildup here begins behind us as well here, Nora, at the Capitol. The flag fly there behind them.
So the family is going to be escorted to a position near the hearse by Major General Howard. and the honors will be rendered. And just as we saw in Houston earlier, 4 ruffles and flourishes and a 21-gun salute.
One of 3 21-gun salutes on this day. You will see My Country 'Tis of Thee played by the Air Force Band as the casket is carried to the hearse. The casket will be carried through a military cordon, then put in that hearse. The family is then, after that, escorted. And there's Sully. So many of us were struck by that picture that Jim McGrath, the president's spokesperson, sent out last night of Sully sitting just under you get goosebumps talking about it.
Yeah.
Under the casket of the former president. Sully was George H.W. Bush's service dog in the last years of his life. And so in addition to all the family we talked about, we know how important.
And there we have, President George W. Bush and Laura Bush departing Air Force One. This is remarkable, as President George W. Bush has talked about that his father knew that the mission of the presidency was more than just about George H.W. Bush, that it was about the office of the presidency. And what he said was that any president must come to the office and strengthen the institution. And while it is his own father, he says he believes that President George H.W. Bush will go down as the greatest one-term president in American history because he presided over a massive change in the global world order.
It was an extraordinary comment in that 60 Minutes interview that you did that struck so many. And I think, as we've all discussed, as George H.W. Bush left office, I'm not sure how many people would have said that. But through the wider lens of history, he feels comfortable saying it now. Maybe others do too. I was thinking about what George W. Bush must have been thinking when he walked on Air Force One earlier today. It was a remarkable image. As he walks with his wife away from it.
He was emotional when I saw him last talking about his father, not only revering his father because he held the same office, but also loved his father deeply. And of course, President George H.W. Bush had suffered a number of health issues. And in just the last 8 months, also losing his mother, Barbara Bush, the true disciplinarian, as they all acknowledged in the family. He never wanted to cross Barbara Bush.
The matriarch. John, maybe you can talk a little bit more about the father-son relationship and the approach that the 41st president took to the 43rd. I mean, I know he obviously took criticism. It wounded him deeply when his son was criticized, but he also didn't want to tell his son what to do.
Well, they had, when George W. Bush was younger, he was not the on-time, ship-shape person that he became later in life. And he and his father had some clashes, including one when he came home and knocked over a garbage can, and they almost came to blows and fisticuffs later in life. And this is important because this isn't just a youthful indiscretion. When George W. Bush talks about his father's unconditional love, it is. Let's pause here now for this portion of the ceremony.
out. Great.
You didn't hear the lyrics, but you heard the song, My Country 'Tis of Thee, which includes, of course, Land Where My Fathers Died. And as George W. Bush now walks with his wife back to a place where he spent so much time returning from his adopted hometown where his father died. And George W. Bush, who buried his mother just 8 months ago. And now his father, the casket of George W. Bush, is in that hearse, which will now make its way to the Capitol.
This is so much, too, about not just mourning the loss of a man, but in some ways mourning an ideal. And I think there's such a nostalgia here in Washington, which I can speak of, and I can imagine around the country and those watching this, for the ideals that he represented. I mean, this was the last president of the greatest generation.
Think of the events and moments in American history that George W. Bush participated in, from World War II, the opening of China, the end of the Cold War. That's pretty extraordinary to think about. And as you all noted this morning, and it's worth noting again here this afternoon, it's worth thinking about now, but it's also, I think, worth talking about that family and those bonds. And John, I know we stopped earlier, but I did want you to pick up on that point, John Dickerson, that you talked about before, and the sometimes tenuous relationship between father and son.
Well, I think it's important just to have that context because they had these clashes. There was another one when George W. Bush didn't show up for a job that he had said he was going to, and his father said, "I'm disappointed in you." The reason this was important is that George W. Bush, and he told Nora this in their interview, he always talked about unconditional love with his father. And that was displayed not in the moments when he was doing well, but in the moments when he fell short of his father's standard. And that's the way he talked about his father, as a beacon. He wrote, he couldn't have realized it at the time, but his words set the standard that both Jeb, his brother, and I would strive to follow when we held public office. And later in his life, George W. Bush would describe himself as a warrior for my dad. When his dad was running for office, George W. Bush was the one who defended him more powerfully and sometimes yelling at reporters strongly than anybody else. And so there's nothing more powerful than a son who tries to live up to their father's standard and then has a father who thinks that that son has indeed met it. And that is where they ended up at the end of their life, with the respect of one president for another. And perhaps most powerfully demonstrated by the fact that 41 didn't kibitz from the sideline a lot about 43 because he knew what the job was like and how hard it was. So he wasn't giving him a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking.
And there's...
John, go ahead.
Jeff, I just want to jump in on the point that John made because it's relevant to both of their presidencies. George Herbert Walker Bush successfully prosecuted the first Iraq War. People forget, but at the time there was a Vietnam syndrome. Could we handle an act of war? Could we carry it out? Could we accomplish our mission, do what we set out to do, build an international coalition, and then leave? That's exactly what George Herbert Walker Bush did. Then George W. Bush prosecuted the second Iraq War. Some people thought because he didn't believe his father had finished the job. And after 9/11, that job needed to be finished, and we're still living with the legacy of that important decision, influenced in part by his own relationship to his father's approach to Iraq.
He also succeeded, not only we've talked about his foreign policy successes, but his domestic legislative successes. I mean, he came into office with a Democratic-controlled Congress and actually got stuff done. The Americans for Disabilities Act. That affects every single one of us. Every time we see an elevator, every time we see the ramp in terms of a bus, that was George H.W. Bush and that Democratic-controlled Congress. The raising of taxes that helped with budget reform there. The Clean Air Act. he was, in some ways too, revered for his ability to get stuff done. While it may have cost him, and certainly the raising of taxes, his reelection.
Another look at Sully here, the dog that has affected so many Americans here as we watch Sully wait underneath George H.W. Bush's casket overnight, and then made again the trip here with him.
Well, the dog represents an organization that has been trying to help our wounded warriors with the help of pets. And of course, George H.W. Bush, a veteran, and he became, yes, you're right, a big famous on Instagram, Insta-famous, as they would say. But more importantly, I think a reminder that this president who served, his son who sent so many young women into war, who died and were wounded, that they care deeply about those who serve and those who are still in great need of care.
We're going to have a lot more coverage of the arrival of the casket of former President George H.W. Bush as we continue here this afternoon. But we're going to leave you just for a moment now as we watch again the hearse set to take off from Joint Base Andrews. This part of the ceremony is concluding right now. We'll be back on the air here from the U.S. Capitol a little later this afternoon. We hope you can join us then. Until then, I'm Jeff Glor, CBS News in Washington.
Let's start talking.
We now join our regular program already in progress.
To the talk. Joining us at the table today is Carrie Ann Inaba from Dancing with the Stars, and from Valerie's Home Cooking, Valerie Bertinelli. Now, let's get started with some good